Mary Ellen. Hello, Renee. How are you today? Not bad. What's up? By the way, Renee, do you know how to land this thing?
Try Googling it.
Have you ever heard of the use of EL and blockchain for a more representational form of voting? Did the lack of lipstick make you question your identity? Were you dreaming about Jojo Saffron Tikka from Shams Al Sewer restaurant in Al Quaz after a year of eating flavored protein bars fashioned to taste like vegan cow?
Sad, I can't pass the AI test.
Call the emergency helpline.
Thank you for calling Space Emergency Hotline. I'm sorry, but all our agents are currently busy dealing with quotas and filling in paperwork. Your call is very important to us. Please stay on the line. Are you exhausted from the trip you just made to Mars and how the climate emergency has
All
become
right,
reality?
this is taking too long. I give up.
For yes,
See you
press
later,
1.
Renee.
For no, press 1. And if you are not sure, press 1 as well. Note that the Mars dust that was being used to print the second housing development was not holding the form in the same manner. Press 1 for yes, otherwise press H for I am hungry. I can eat some Mars dust for dinner tonight. If you are one of our prestigious Cloud X shuttle customers and experiencing a parachute malfunction, please press 9.
What took you so long?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We know how many testing hoops you've had to go through to be here. So really thank you. And thank you for making the trip from New York. Thank you to the Expo team, the Alserkal team, our sponsors, DP World, for everything. Really, the details of everything have been perfect. And to everyone whose upstream effort has gone into shaping the thinking behind today's conversation. My name is Kevin Jones. I'm the Director of Strategy at Alserkal. And I'm here with artist and activist, Mary Ellen Carrol. And sadly, Renée Cummings, who you see referenced in Mike Kwok's film, was unable to come for varied COVID-related complications, but she's here in spirit. I'd like to just start very briefly by saying a word about the Cultures in Conversation series, of which today is a part. Today is the 6th week of Cultures in Conversation, as part of Program for People and Planet run by Expo. So Cultures in Conversation is commissioned by Expo 2020 Dubai and is programmed by Alserkal Advisory. And this week is dedicated, or has been dedicated, to travel and connectivity. And we're very happy to sort of end the week on what we hope will be an interesting conversation for you. And this specific conversation, The Cloud is Nobody's, is in association with Emirates and Etisalat. In partnering with Expo 2020 to bring you Cultures and Conversations, we've brought together really vanguard thinkers, artists, researchers, academics, who help us question the burning issues of today. So our point in doing this kind of different take on a talk series is in order to bring audiences to a point where they can reimagine some of these questions and not necessarily kind of take it from a vertical analysis, but come at it a little bit more laterally. So it's a kind of meta-narrative, if you like, that offers reflection, awareness, and re-envisioned approaches. And what we hope is that it activates new questions from you going forward. So let me introduce Mary Ellen. I'll stop talking soon. And I think Mary Ellen is perhaps best known locally for this image, which some of you may know. And it's an iconic work, especially for us at Alserkal. I mean, we see it every day, but somehow it doesn't blend into the landscape. It still pops out. And you and I went to visit it yesterday. I forced you to take a picture in front of it. But and you had a bit of a teary moment. And it's interesting how you said that the work is kind of outside of you, but also sort of very much attached still. And I think this is a great example of the potency of a lot of your practice, which we'll come to in a second. So this thinking and the way that you approach, again, in big infrastructural pieces, we see echoes of that throughout. So very simply and crisply to introduce Mary Ellen, she's an artist, but also an activist. This activism runs very deep in her practice. And I think the way to summarize it best is that you really are investigating a single fundamental question that keeps coming up across everything, which is, what do we consider a work of art? How can we actually, what is a work of art? And again, when I talk about how we come at these things laterally, we're hoping that through discussing art and culture around questions like bias in algorithms and artificial intelligence and racial injustice and how it's hardwired into artificial intelligence and algorithms specifically, we kind of are led to question what is it that art can do for us. And so I think what's interesting also about your practice is that you've looked at a lot of different disciplines. You collaborate very deeply. You're extremely well entrenched in many different places around the world, and you work with these different artists, but also researchers and academics and policymakers. And I think that what's really interesting and what we'll see today is the use of unexpected materials in her practice. So infrastructure becomes a material. The way a painter would use paint, Mary Ellen uses infrastructure. Mary Ellen uses policy as a material, which we'll see in some of these, in some of our examples going forward. So in the spirit of raising awareness around some of these questions, we hope that you'll leave today with a different angle of questioning on things like ethics in artificial intelligence and bias. And some of the kind of unfairness that's out there that has sort of very insidiously passed into the technologies that we use and that we take for granted. So hopefully this will open up some new avenues of questioning for you. And as a kind of epigraph to today, I want to, I mean, again, this is an image that Mary Ellen will develop more thoroughly, but I think we're fortunate not only for Deeper World's great hospitality and superior tech, but we're also right next to the American Pavilion, which has this giant rocket and a star-spangled rocket shop to go with it. And I think this is really fortuitous, because you didn't know when we chose the venue that it was going to be this close. And of course, this is also what Mike Kwok is alluding to slightly in his film, this sort of part of this ideology and the malfunctioning of this. But before we get to this, tell us, like, Mike, how you came across Mike, some of the thanks that need to be said to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard as well.
Sure. So first, I just want to reiterate my thanks for being back in Dubai, and to Alserkal Avenue, and also to Expo. It's really, you know, given these times that we're living in, I was extremely excited to be coming back to the region and to be here and to be with, you know, people that I really trust, and both intellectually but also culturally in terms of what we're doing. So thank you for that. And so Mike Kwok, who did the opening introduction that you saw, was a graduate student at GSD at Harvard. And the studio that Christoph Wadishko and Malkit Shoshan invited me to be a guest critic during the semester. And Mike's work that I saw, he wasn't making architecture in that sense of doing a model. He was actually building cities and entire platforms that would be used for gaming. So the excitement for that and how he used all the materials and forms was something that I, you know, sort of stored away and thought, well, at some moment, and then when the opportunity to come and give this talk came up, it seemed really appropriate to ask him to be a part of this. So that's what you ended up seeing. He's now working on his PhD in London, so education continues, but that was the start.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll do some more with Mike in the near future. We have him thinking away on other projects. But to come back to this image, so SpaceX, Boca Chica, you were down there for a project with the American Civil Liberties Union, I believe, a work about mapping asylum, which is what brought you down there in the first place, and then there was this sort of SpaceX reared its mighty head, and it led you somewhere else. So tell us a little bit about how those projects sort of segued, or the initial idea of mapping asylum and immigration, and then SpaceX.
So before, I mean, basically my entire life I've been involved in migration and immigration all over the world. And in fact, when I lived in the Philippines in the 80s, and it has continued. So one of the things in working down in Texas for the past 2 decades is that it's brought me down to the border. The world saw a lot of some of the recent things that happened, and namely the issues related to the children. So in our work, it brought us back, back down to the border. And so being there before COVID, it was the right time to go back again. So Brownsville, Texas is where that location was, and then to revisit what is going on both on the US as well as the Mexico side, but then to also go to Boca Chica, where there was nothing, you know, 5 years ago, and then suddenly the image that you're seeing, I mean, I was shocked. So that's a 2-lane road that goes to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a national wildlife refuge where the sea turtles, and suddenly you see this entire, you know, starbase, the space campus, which is going to be used actually for consumer flights, actually. So it's just a note on that. So it was this combination and that juxtaposition of those two things, you know, it was kind of crazy because of what the impact it has both on the area, but there's that kind of, that simultaneity of looking at these things and what's actually in front of you and how is it as that it actually is.
And that land use as well. I mean, they would have kind of taken over land that would have been used for completely other purposes. I'm guessing that the private would have become.
Exactly. And I think you're noting about the US Pavilion. I mean, think about the infrastructure of building Expo and how long it's been in development. I mean, it's probably been over at least 6 years.
Yeah, I don't really know, but I'm imagining the thinking
Yeah.
and planning would have been for a long time, yeah.
So,
From before the winning of the bid, I'm imagining, but...
yeah. So in seeing what's, the U.S. pavilion is and then seeing this, it's sort of parallelism that's probably been going on that amount of time.
So next, this is the title of our talk today, which Mary Ellen chose. And it's funny because the Expo team very endearingly says that whenever there's an unusual title for a talk, they know that it's from Alserkal. So we thank you for kind of helping us maintain our reputation in this. But if you could unpack it a little bit for us, just tell us what it means to you, this idea of a cloud is nobody's.
Well, part of it, somebody said it's very poetic, and I'm all for more poetry being used. And of course, when my practice is categorized as conceptual, it is. Everything begins in language for me, right? It starts with writing. And so in thinking about access and the internet and wireless and how COVID has actually, in the present, futurized us in a certain sense, right? So this need for connectivity, right, of what we're talking about under travel and connectivity, of how we can move, where can we go, where can we just stay within the same place, and so how that's actually done. And then the use of the cloud in the internet, which is not a cloud at all. It's a, room of servers located in certain parts of the world that is giving you access. So where is that sense of public versus private, and who owns the cloud?
Yeah, okay. And so your conclusion is that it should not be owned. I mean, it is ownerless, in a sense. It is borderless.
Yeah, I think it's as I said, that's how it is, right? It's to, show things as they are. I mean, that's what we do as artists, right? The representation, the questioning, the presentation, the engagement.
Okay, so then if it's nobody's, how can it become useful? How can it become publicly useful? Right? So how can this tech somehow no longer be compartmentalized, but be opened up, let's say, again, off your idea that it's nobody's, be opened up to public good?
So when you're talking about using policy, and we'll get to that with Prototype 180, which is sort of my opus, but in Public Utility 2, the image that you're seeing is actually an image of radio frequency. So it's how the spectrum, and the spectrum or radio frequency is everywhere, right? There's not a territory for it, it's everywhere, but how it gets regulated. And so in that, what you're seeing is that area that's Public Utility 2 is actually when there were UHF and VHF channels, and they went from from analog to digital, suddenly all of that real estate became open. And so the thing with tech and policy is that they always sort of happen together. So if we're sitting, right, at the FCC offices in the 80s, and I said, Kevin, what about, that 2.4 gigahertz, and how's your sandwich? And you said, oh, wait, you mean that garbage frequency, the one that's used for your baby monitor, your remote control, your garage door opener? And I said, yeah. And I said, well, why don't we open it up? Why don't we leave it unlicensed? So the thinking is that if you think about public space, right, and where we have public spaces, why that's the equivalent, right? It's the analog to saying, okay, we can have public space in these radio frequencies, right? So that's what Wi-Fi is. It's just one little sliver. But this would have opened up basically canyons. And ultimately, it didn't happen, but there's ways in which, you show how it's actually used of what the last mile is, right?
And so how is the art working in this? How is culture and how is your own practice sort of determining what's happening with public utility. Because this is a project as well that's been, that we see in Prospect, right? In Prospect 3 in New Orleans.
Yeah, no, exactly. It originated in, I mean, we've been working on this since 2008, right? So it really takes, and things tend to be durational, except for my sleep. But, and part of this was you had to create these devices, which are, they're software-defined radios to get access to that space. So, you know, you can have a plot of land. What are you going to do on it, right? Is it going to be a work of land art? So in saying, you know, it's kind of apt to say that it's a 21st century form of land art, albeit for, you know, the airwaves. And so what you do and how you do with it. So we were privileging, and still are, culture, right? What can be produced as an artist within that space. And I think during COVID, we've seen, you know, so much of how necessary it is, right? And then working with also other organizations. So we're working with Denniston Hill, which is a residency that the artists Julie Meritu and Paul Pfeiffer and Lawrence Chua have upstate. So it has different instances, and it will also, including in Prototype 180.
Okay, which we'll get to in a second.
Yeah.
But just a word on the, like, this super Wi-Fi as well, which is another thing that you've tried to open up and bring into areas that were really sort of not serviced by Wi-Fi at all, simply for economic reasons, that it wasn't worth it to, for companies to actually provide services. So can you tell us a little bit about that, the destabilization in that project as well?
Yeah, so I mean, there's now a new chunk of space that's been opened up. That's called the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, and it has different. It's just a higher frequency. But you know where these things begin, and where this image is. This is in New Orleans during Prospect and at the installation, and so it's just showing how within, you know, the kind of community and having people come in. And it reminds me a lot of the spaces at Alserkal, right? Both on the interior and the outside of where people come together. But you also are making the policy push to say, right, as an artist to go in front of, you know, the policy makers, right? I mean, we went down to DC and to, you know, have discussions and conversations with the FCC about, look at, if you leave this open, it will be exponentially more beneficial, but also financially more remunerative, right? In terms of, but that ended up not being the case.
So the policy never actually changes along with it. Okay. And Prospect is a triennial, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
It's a triennial that takes over the city and has this inflection, or at least this one did, of a very community-based sort of democratized sort of approach. So let's move to the next chapter, which is data as resistance. So any good activist is going to resist, right? So how? I mean, I think this is really the question of, like, it's one thing to say all of these things, and we hear a lot of manifestos about, and even like the research that I've been doing around this, there are a lot of, there's a lot of goodwill, right? There's a lot of intelligent people looking at this and researching it, but I'm curious about outcomes. I'm curious about where is the real resistance. So I guess the question that I'm saying is how can it create agency? How can it create this will to actually change things for people who are marginalized, for people who are, let's say, oppressed, or who suffer, you know, from you know, racial injustice. I mean, this systemic injustice that is everywhere. Again, like, this image is something that we've spoken about, but again, how specifically within this, how can data be used to change this?
Well, I think one of the things to begin with is that all of our data is being used. So it's not only people that are in under-resourced communities or under-resourced themselves, we're all. So there's a lot of work being done on data activism for your individual self, right? Keeping your own data and making sure that there are protocols in place, that things aren't being mined and utilized for somebody else's benefit, right? Who's capitalizing on it in big tech. And the image, to go back to then Brownsville, to carry the kind of through line on migration and climate migration, which is something that we're going to get to. But this image is actually from people that are coming through into the US and seeking asylum. And so if you look closely, you see an ankle monitor on the foot of this woman. And this is a way of data being tracked, which you can make the argument of it being beneficial and not, in the sense of, how somebody is able to go back into the community and engage in the process. I think that, all of these things need to be, sort of looked at and interrogated even for ourselves, right, in terms of what the process is and who's actually creating them, right? Who's doing the writing, who's making the AI, right? I mean, at a certain point it generates itself, but there is a starting point. And so within that, from the get-go, I mean, we even talked about this. I mean, when Google lets go of the two main ethics people working on this, what are they doing right?
Yeah.
And how is that being done?
But I mean, this is a double-edged sword, because there's surveillance as well as kind of, to a degree, having your own data, taking control of your own data. But that taking control is very hard to do. I mean, for every, identification document that you control, there are many, many others that slip through your control. So again, in the case of the Mexican to US immigrant, and this is an image that you've used before, who arrives with nothing, like no papers, because they've just swam across a river at great peril. But so how do they, like, where does that even begin to happen, that they own, that they can land with, okay, well, here are my documents, because I own my own data and it's always with me.
Well, I like that your hand is making this gesture like holding a phone, because most people, have phones, right? And so if that information and who you are, right, can move with you, and mind you, people are coming from all over the world, right? I mean, and where people are moving from, and these migration patterns that we're seeing more and more and more of. But that information of you say who you say you are, what is the supporting information that's provided? So with that, we've been working very closely with a group called the Innovation Law Lab. And this came out of what you were talking about, the mapping project with Legalent and the ACLU that was done on showing how this process even takes place, because even the policymakers didn't know what was being done. But with that, we always go back to sort of privilege who is closest to the ground and needs it the most, and then it affects everybody. So that's where it originates.
Okay, and the work with the people on the ground is still ongoing, I'm imagining. So again, I mean, my question before we get to wildfires and climate change, but I mean, this is vast. I mean, and as you say, the question is to question the question, right? Who is writing the algorithms? Who is coding this in the first place? Because that's largely, well, it may not be the only source of bias, but it is a significant source of bias. That this thing is skewed from the start. So there's like, one would look at it and say, well, there's very little hope of this actually ever changing. But where do you stand in relation to, like, my pessimism about this, for example? How would you react to that? How would you argue against it?
Well, I think it's good to be suspicious, right? I mean, I think it's good to ask questions about things and question how they can be done. I mean, look at some of these things, they're massive issues like climate, right? The climate emergency. And I think having just been at COP26 in Glasgow, it's a very different conversation that's being held now, because one of the things is that we're physically experiencing, everybody in the world is physically experiencing the effects. And so what can be done? And I think that the work that the climate organizations did early on to have an impact one of the things that I really saw was that there was a shift now to where the companies and governments are actually captaining, right, those types of efforts, much more so, and in concert with people that are on the street, but also the organizations that have been doing the work for decades.
Okay, and your own work with climate is old. I mean, you've been at it for quite a long time. I think you said from the first Earth Day, but which is the first Earth Day must be from like the seventh. Okay, we won't go there. But the first Earth Day is a very nice way of putting it. But so tell us a little bit about this progression of climate change as well. Again, this injustice, because it's a huge site of disequilibrium and you know, of injustice to again disenfranchised populations largely.
Well, and what do you do? I mean, you know, I didn't want to, it's, in 2006, I mean, maybe we can show the next image of, I was commissioned by an organization called the Precipice Alliance that was started by the photographer Jill Sternfeld and the editor Donna Wingate. And they were commissioning large-scale works on pressing issues, and climate was the first one. So remember, in 2006, people weren't really having the conversation as they were in the public. And so the initial site, we put it up in an industrial part of New Jersey on the Pulaski site where millions of people would go by and see it.
This were, I mean, large scale, a little bit like we have at Alserkal, large scale.
Well, fast forward, 2008 happened, right? The mortgage crisis, economic downturn that affected the entire world. And so the organization and also climate, right, in terms of its pressing the need for action to be taken, ended up being really mothballed. Well, here we were, you know, 2019, when the climate summit was taking place in New York, but there were zero, you know, diplomatic relations at that time with the US and the UN, and then Glasgow was happening, and so the opportunity came through the arts program at Urban Office, which is similar to Alserkal in Glasgow, to put indestructible language back up into the world. And so it's still there, and most likely it will remain there.
Okay. So I do want to ask a question about the differential between these 2 years, but can you tell us something about the title, Indestructible Language?
Well, it is indestructible.
Okay,
I mean, language is indestructible, but the phrase, as you can see, is that it is green, thinks nature, even in the dark. And that was about 6 months of work consistently to have every word have a kind of value and autonomy. And also to anticipate, I mean, this is so naive now to say this, but that it would be there would be mitigation, right? We wouldn't be in the situation. Things wouldn't change so precipitously to the bad, right, as we're seeing it today. So the other thing is that the work had, you know, in terms of it being in the world, now the other part that we were really conscientious of is that it's a call to act, but it's action. So we have an equivalent program on the ground that we're doing. It's called RSVP, that we're working with a group called Terra Firma that works on climate migration, with Suchi Reddy, who has a design and architecture firm, Ready Made Design, and then Jessica Marshall, who's a writer. So that's, and it amplifies these other programs that are being done, right? So
on the ground in Glasgow, or?
Well, the neon piece is up in the sky, and you can see in the background, the kind of green is the illumination where the climate summit took place, but then the invisible part is what we're doing, both on the ground and at the border, but then there's an international network, and also at a site in the Bronx. Physically.
So the difference, in your opinion, then between 2006 and now is that more people care, or that the consciousness is higher, the awareness is higher?
I would say it's much higher. Yeah, I think that it's much higher because it's also, as I said, people see it, right? We see it in, you know, the heat and the fires and the hurricanes and that. So there's physical evidence, right? that this is actually taking place. Unless you want to, you know, as it says, remain in the dark and you know.
Yeah, no, but it is. Okay, so there's work going on the ground, and this is happening. And then I'm imagining that this will be reiterated for COP28, that this is not something that stops, not that the work is rated with, but the work, the on-the-ground work ricochets
absolutely.
out.
Continues, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So ethical imagination, again, this is the third and penultimate part of our talk. And again, this is a pillar, I'd say, of your practice most recently. And you and I first kind of collaborated in a not entirely finished collaboration, by the way, so something else to look forward to, but around the idea of an artist takeover of the Alserkal.online website, specifically with your work on ethical imagination. And I know that it's a little bit like the cloud is nobody's. It sounds good, but there's more, like there's some potency to it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that potency?
Sure. So first, I mean, the framing of the ethical imagination was generously, I mean, provided by our friend, the writer from Kenya, Ivana Jambo-Awor, who I had the great fortune to see at Kenyatta University about 8 years ago. And she was talking about the ethical imagination, and not to the people in the front of the audience, but to the students sitting in the back, saying, this is your, you know, this is your call. This is like your siren of what you need to be thinking about and how you need to do it. And it was something of like, you know, I mean, people talk about the moral imagination, but the ethical, in terms of the collective whole, was something that stayed, you know, and resonated. And Ivana and I have done some work together in that, but then another program came up and commissioned through something called 2030 Visions, where they said, give us your wildest, like, imagination. That we said, well, we want to do, you know, a TV show that's political satire, and have, you know, Lady Bunny, the drag queen, be the interlocutor. And they said, that's too wild, like, that's too big. But within that, we were going to create and use the blockchain for a registry of ideas and develop a token, and then also come up with a collective decision-making tool. So those two parts ended up coming to fruition. So my collaborator, Meredith Finkelstein, who's a very, very, very good technologist and actually, in a similar way, uses poetry and programming as a material. But we developed the EI, which is a token, and where we invited people to make contributions, and then they were actually given EI tokens. So these will then come in as using ideas as currency, but where even one of the platforms of someone that works on scientific papers that are developed and peer review, and that process is going to start using EI in the background. So it's usable in its form now, but it's also taking how we use the structure of blockchain, which everybody, you know, probably wants to go to sleep now, but that's what's so fascinating is about this indelible and decentralized program.
Okay, so it's the registry of these ideas that actually makes them interesting. But so is this another example of like language becoming, this is an actual reality now. You're not in language anymore necessarily as an artist. You're in, you know, the world with the tokens in the blockchain and very specific ideas having, you know, a place in that chain and registered, an indelible existence in the chain, and being real ideas that are then exchanged in real life.
Well, it can have that utility, but the premise of it was that, you know, the work of art only has to be itself. It doesn't have to have any other kind of function. And the way in which you relate or engage with something, that's your experience with that thing. Now, there can be consensus where, when we just went to Gray Noise to see the show, and there was, a consent of like, well, this is really incredible to see, the work that is here. And that kind of thing can happen. So what we were doing is like we were taking it literally as a material to create the structure and show what could be done. And then, but it could be appropriated by somebody else, which happens all the time. I mean, I always think of that, use of like the Fishley and Weiss video of the way things go. That's like this Rube Goldberg machine or one thing, and then suddenly it's a Mazda commercial. So hopefully it retains that autonomy, but then it can be appropriated and put into use. And that was one of the ideas of 2030, is that they wanted to be instrumentalized in some way.
Actually activated. Yeah. Okay, and then I think lastly there's this idea of quadratic voting, which again is something for me that's sort of in the world. That is, if you're looking at, and we'll come to this in a minute, but you are very interested in the tools of decision making and how policy is fashioned and how these people in power are making decisions. So quadratic voting, and I'll let you explain the difference between one-to-one and one-to-many. But this is your kind of incursion into decision-making tools and using this almost as a kind of material as well. And also, just for reference, Gray Noise is a gallery at Alserkalavenue, which at the moment has a very interesting show, so you should all go.
So in that, right, so you have all these, ideas, right, so that are generated for these EIs, as we refer to them. And then, but if you have to choose one, why do you have to choose one? What if you can actually, vote on your intensity of like, I feel more strongly about this and less so strong. I'm still interested in that. And so the economists, Glenn Weil and Eric Posner, who really developed quadratic voting and came up with this, was also about how can we change these systems, right? That we think it's like the use of the blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Like, who would have thought that there would be sovereignless money or as an exchange system? And so I think that if we continue to sort of look at it, doesn't mean that we're always jettisoning, right, the systems that are in place. I mean, nobody stopped painting. But there's ways in which we can think about these things where there's a more equitable manner in which they can be representational.
Okay. So we're looking at interest, as you said, the intensity of the interest rather than the yes-no kind of the direction of where I'm thinking. It's actually expressing intensity, and hence is more representational or fair in its representation. Okay, and so to stick with this idea of voting, I think that this last thought that structures our talk is something that I came up with when we were, I'm kind of patting myself on the back. Like,
thank you.
Yeah, but which when we were still in conversation with Renée about her process as well, where both of you seem to invert things. You turn things on their head. So not that you invented quadratic voting, but that the use of quadratic voting as a new form of decision-making tool, or how you're sort of looking at policy as a material and disrupting it and disturbing it, seems interesting, questioning these structures, as we said earlier, what you do. So quadratic voting seems to me one of those, but Prototype 180, which is, again, a project that we'll talk about in depth, because it is very emblematic of a lot of the thinking that you're doing in your practice and have been for some time, is also very closely dealing with policy as a material and how you mess around with it. So tell us a little bit. The 180 in the title of Prototype 180 refers to the shift. So I'll let you, I don't want to force
No,
feed.
so it refers to, Prototype 180 is an ongoing work that I started in 1999. Stuck in traffic, leaving my graduate students at the University of California. And the one thing that I was thinking about was land art, of course, and how there had been really a vacuum from the 60s and 70s. When Frank Gehry did Bilbao, he kind of usurped that role of art in the public and put it on the facade of the building, where literally the facade was the sculpture, which Richard Serra has some things to say about. And then what I started to think about was like, why don't we use then policy as a material? And where's the condition that's antithetical to what is the norm? And so Houston, Texas chose itself because there's no zoning there. There's no land use policy there. So this idea of free enterprise or the market determining where things to be is how the city actually developed. And so with that, so it became the site, and then the initial gesture would be to make architecture actually perform, but ultimately as a work of art. And that the catalytic moment would be a 180-degree revolution of the plot of land and the single-family home, ultimately, that was chosen for that to be done.
Okay, so in the shifting of the house, you've completely, so what was at the back is now at the front, and what never saw the sun now does, and so that's the kind of just the physical layer of it. But also there was a policy outcome. By doing this, you actually drew attention to this lack of zoning. Or, I mean, how did that, sort of, how did the policy incision happen, much the way that the sort of architectural incision happened?
Well, that's a good, I mean, it happened in the public, and it happened in mayoral forums, but of course, you know, getting a politician to say yes or no is difficult, but they did. I mean, in terms of the mayoral forum that I conducted was to ask, you know, if they would support land use policy and zoning, and hands down, every candidate said no. I mean, this wasn't really a surprise because they've tried to have it legislated, you know, 4 times, and it's never passed. So the one thing, you know, is that people like say, well, that's, you know, it's bad, or it's not a value judgment, right? It's not a good or a bad thing. It's just, this is how it is, and that's the condition. That's essentially really a cultural condition that's there. Now, it's having an impact that you can see after the hurricanes and the building and what has actually happened within the city, but it's also then it provokes in a way, but it also sustains the conversation and what can be done and how we can return back to it.
Okay. And so, and it's still there. I mean, you can actually go, but what is its life today? And besides the awareness raising and the questioning.
So the life today, if you go back to that slide, what happened was Hurricane Harvey, and then there was another incident when they were developing in the 50s. And so they would plot out the homes and put in the steel and pour the foundation. In the middle of the night, they would yank out the steel because they would save, after the city inspector would come, a certain amount of money. We had this checked thoroughly by engineers, and unbeknownst to us, the area in the back had no steel in it. So when we were doing the revolution, right before, a week before we were ready to go, the entire back collapsed. Not a good thing when you're in the middle of a New York Times interview and an expletive and the building does this kind of thing. But what ended up happening is that then it goes back to, how do we define a house? And what is the structure if the structure remained intact? So that's what actually ended up being moved. Fast forward then to 2017 was then the hurricane came through and also had a huge impact. And so ultimately the decision was to unbuild the entire thing, which I ended up doing in a kind of choreographed performance to take it all apart. And we saved all the construction debris, not knowing exactly what was going to be done, but in anticipation of something. So then it was basically the plinth without the sculpture on it. And in working with some of the people that are doing work on like ethnobotanic gardens and parks, but which is the next image, propositionally. And then I had the good fortune of actually going to see, right, this public space. And the building in the background is a county hospital. It's a public hospital.
In Texas.
In Texas, in Houston. It's LBJ. What they saw were high levels of diabetes in people. And so ultimately, the CEO hired an organic farmer. And they have a farm at the hospital, and they have a pharmacy where they actually have items that people go into the store and work with, you know, their oncologists and their internists and the rest of the team of the dietitians. And they've seen these numbers drop precipitously. So in anticipation of some of the programs you're going to be doing on food and wellness, all of this is in the ether right now.
Yeah. And it's all interconnected.
Yeah.
Again, these questions are, even in health and wellness, I mean, I think that we do come across issues of unfairness and issues of disequilibrium.
So what's happening on the ground is some of this will be incorporated into some of the program because the site is actually sizable. But then the other part that is the next image that we're going to see
the debris.
is actually, it goes back to space. And this is an image of Marcia, a company called Space Factory that a man named David Mallet, who was a partner at KPF, the architecture firm, and did super skyscrapers, mainly in China and South Asia. But then he wanted to go further higher, and so they developed a technique using these robots to 3D print with material on Mars and on the moon. So in being introduced to him and then having the leftover material from Prototype 180 that we saved, they're able to take and make this composite with this secret sauce, right, that we can actually rebuild Prototype 180 again. So that's the phase 3 that you can see in the next image.
Yeah.
That just gives an idea of it. So, and you know, look at 3D printing is you know, I mean, it's a very useful technique. Is it that interesting? Not really, but to be able to use that and complete this cycle to remake this thing out of itself, right?
Yeah.
So it reconstitutes itself into a form that's the same form, but in the 21st century.
Right, which brings us back to this,
Yeah.
the second part of the famous work. But I just want to say one thing also about AI Space Factory is when you go to, after our conversation, I actually went and did some investigation on it, and the language is all sustainability, and you know, it's couched in a kind of like real, you know, the same language that we're using to promote practices of fairness and awareness and consciousness are being used. So there's just a transposition of that into building in space and into colonizing it, creating new worlds in space. But yeah, so we wanted to kind of bookend this conversation with this work, which, you know, again, if one sees kind of regularly when traveling through Dubai, but also because of the cyclical nature of these projects that you're doing, and because, again, for me, one of the questions is, who takes care of it? Like, I mean, who is actually running these projects on the ground? So yes, as I said in the beginning, you are working with lots of different people in these different instances, and it is their practices then take over. But how do you see this kind of stewardship of these durational types of projects that that also seem very again, this idea of potency to the degree that they can spawn new things as well, right? That they will lead people to think of other projects within those projects. And I think Prospect, a triennial like that is designed precisely to do things like that, to generate these sort of ripple effects. So who does it? Who takes care of it? And at what point do you remain the steward or abdicate from the stewardship role? And does the artist ever abdicate? I mean, that's the other question. I mean, yes, the work of art only has to be itself, but the artist, can the artist ever walk away from it? Like the way that you can't walk away from that. Like you're, like it's not outside of you, it's still very much inside of you. If I'm going to be psychoanalytical about it.
Well, I think that you're right. I mean, I think one of it is that, look at it, it talks about like the relationship and trust, right? And so the ability, I think that one of the things that, you were just talking about, and I think that a lot of these, people that are doing biennials now and these other forms of exhibition making is where there's a commitment that's made. And so there's, sometimes it's just the piece of work that gets plopped down and has the kind of sensation that gets the attention, and then it can be there and it can be relocated someplace else. But sometimes it's something that's much more committed and durational, and to go back, right, and to, continue to work. So I think that one of the things that's evidence of that is, the relationship that I have to Alserkal and to Dubai, and this trust, and that those works are, being stewarded through in a way. And that's also a question of that you make the right decision, and you don't always know how things are going to end up working out, but you hope, with diligence and I think intelligence, and that there's an alignment that will, ensure that these things are done, in this manner.
Okay. Okay, that's a very touching way of putting it, and I think we really are running out of time. But I do want to know what else is coming up. Like I know, so we should congratulate Marianne on winning the Rome Prize of the American Academy in Rome, and you'll be going there in February to work on a 6-month. I mean, you'll be there for 6 months working on a project which will probably ripple across decades, as is your wont. But you'll go there for this project starting in February. What will that be? Like, is that a reiteration of something that you've already worked on? Is it new research? What will you be working on in that sort of residency there?
So what you present, I mean, the sort of selection is propositional, but some of it's going to be some extension of the work that we've done, with like public utility too. Okay. But also in a different form, based on some of the things that have been done with FM, like radio, for instance. But we're going higher and lower, and then there's some other collaborations in terms of the built environment, right? So, a kind of modified form of land art that will be done further south, basically in the boot. And then some of the other, work, there's a connection that translates in terms of climate migration, that will move with Terraform and some of the organizations that we're working with, and cultural.
And the work with mapping immigration continues, or?
Pardon?
The work with the ACLU and that mapping.
Well, that continues, but it's also that's so country specific, right? Yeah. I mean, but I think that one of the things, that's a good point of like thinking about that as, looking at the policy all over the world and making that not only evident, but available. And because it was, shocking's too strong, but to have the understanding of even like the lawyers or the policymakers, the people that have to make a decision to leave themselves, where it was universal that people didn't have an understanding of what really was involved. So then, that ends up being something that actually does have utility. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. Well, thank you. We've said a lot of thanks, but we'll continue to thank people. Thank you, Renée.
Thank you.
your disturbed sleep.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for coming. Our hosts, our organizers, our sponsors, our minders, our dressers, our beauticians. DP World, by the way, is offering a tour of this really interesting pavilion, and there are galleries that sort of spiral up to the top. It's really worth going on this tour if you have some time to. And again, we want to thank them for their magnificent hosting. And I think we also have, yes, a preview of the upcoming events within Cultures in Conversation. So it's a busy month for January. As you see, this is one of many. Global Goals Week is upon us already, apparently. So we will be working with SEMA Dance, which is quite a respected dance company, contemporary dance company here in Dubai, whose home is in Alserkal on the 22nd in the Sun Stage. On the 29th, this Practices of Care, which will also take place in DP Pavilion, but upstairs in the Majlis. Very interesting group of people as well, working in this direction. They're trying to change, and I think this will to transform and using art and artists to think differently about these questions and push this transformation. This is what we're trying to kind of harness through these encounters. And then in February, we move to a food week, perhaps on a lighter note, but you'd be surprised. And then water as well, which will be back in the Terra Pavilion, which is where we started, so talk about cyclical. Thank you again.
Thank you.